Hello and welcome to pmclounge.com. Today we are discussing the basics of stakeholder management, the very basics. So if you have not read about stakeholder management at all, then this should be your first video to understand this knowledge area known as stakeholder management. If you have read something about stakeholder management, forget all of it and focus on this session. This is going to be a primer for your understanding of the entire stakeholder management knowledge area. Now, if you are into reading articles, if you would rather read about stakeholder management, then first link in the description will take you to a relevant article on this topic over at our official website pmclounge.com. So you can check the first link out. Second link will be the entire playlist of every single video that we have done on stakeholder management knowledge area. So two important links, just wanted to let you know about it. Stakeholder management, let's get into the basics of this knowledge area. This of course is the last knowledge area that you're going to study as part of your PMP courseware. So let's get started. All right, let's talk about stakeholders now. Who really are stakeholders? What is the definition of a stakeholder and what are some of the examples of stakeholders for your project? So let's look at a definition first. So stakeholder is any person, group or organization whose interests may be positively or negatively impacted or even perceived to be impacted by the project. The keyword here is impacted. So if someone who is going to be positively or negatively impacted by your project, they are definitely your stakeholders. Someone who even perceives that they may be impacted by your project, they are also your stakeholders. Now, this definition is actually not complete. The other part of this definition is that a stakeholder is also someone who can exert positive or negative influence over the project. So the keyword in this sentence is going to be influence. So someone who can exert positive or negative influence over the project, they are also your stakeholders. So someone who is impacted by your project, someone who can impact your project because that someone has the influence. So the overall definition in simpler words could be anyone that can impact the project, be impacted by it, or perceived to be impacted by it is a stakeholder. Three things. Anyone who can impact your project, your CEO can definitely impact your project. Anyone who can be impacted by your project, let's say your project automates a certain operation which is going to result in reduction of jobs in a certain industry, right? So those people whose jobs are going to be impacted, they are the ones who are impacted by your project. And someone who perceives to be impacted. So let's say there's certain organization or a certain department within the organization which is not going to be impacted by your project. They are not the ones who are going to lose jobs, but they perceive that they may lose their jobs. So all three are stakeholders of your project. Effective engagement and involvement of stakeholders is critical for project's success. And that is why the entire stakeholder management knowledge area is so important, because your project success definitely depends upon managing the stakeholders effectively, engaging them effectively, and involving them effectively throughout the life cycle of the project. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the examples. Who are these stakeholders anyway? Project manager, you're the project manager, you're definitely a stakeholder of the project. Congratulations. The project team members, they are also stakeholders of your project. Project team members can include everyone, right? Everyone who's part of your project team, they are stakeholder. And these two are actually the kind of people, the project manager and the project team, that would come to your mind the first when you think about project stakeholders. But let's take a look at some others. Senior management is also a stakeholder of your project. Remember, we talked about the CEO in the previous slide. CEO is definitely a stakeholder in your project. Project sponsor, the one who's paying for the project, is definitely a stakeholder. The customer is a stakeholder. Remember the definition, someone who can impact or someone who can be impacted by your project. Customer definitely falls in that category. End users. So if your customer plans to sell the product of your project to end users, they can also be stakeholders in your project. Vendors, suppliers, we talked so much about procurement management knowledge area recently. It was the previous knowledge area. You already know who the vendors are. You already know what suppliers mean. They are definitely stakeholders of your project. Competitors can also be your stakeholders. Why? Remember the definition. Someone who can impact your project or someone who can be impacted by your project, even someone who perceives that they may be impacted by your project. They are all your project stakeholders, and competitors definitely fit in this definition. People who might be impacted by the project. So anyone that we have left out, any kind of people that could be impacted by the project, they are also stakeholders. People who perceive that they may be impacted by the project, this is right out of the definition we discussed in the previous slide. Social pressure groups that can impact the project, like environmentalists. So let's say your project is about constructing a shopping mall at a place which is right now a park. Very cliched example, but just taking it for the sake of simplicity. So if you are constructing a mall at a place which is right now a public park, a public garden, definitely environmentalists could be a stakeholder of your project. Government or political leadership, of course. Government changes rules. If government changes rules, your project may be impacted. If the government says you cannot build a mall on top of the park, on top of the garden, right? Your project can be stalled overnight. So government or political leadership, they are also stakeholders as part of your project. So these are some of the examples of who can be stakeholders in your project. Now, I know what you're thinking. Every person under the sun could be a possible stakeholder of your project. Well, not really. If you chalk down, if you sit down and start to jot down who all are going to be stakeholders of your project, you'll definitely have a long list, but it is not going to be as big as everyone under the sun. All right, so let's take a quick look at what the stakeholder management knowledge area is all about. So the processes of this knowledge area helps you identify stakeholders, keep them engaged, and ensure that stakeholder satisfaction is achieved. So this is what the processes of stakeholder management knowledge area is all about. This is what these processes focus on. This is the PGKA mapping. You have four processes in the stakeholder management knowledge area. The initiating process group process is known as identify stakeholders. Then you've got planning process group. The process is called plan stakeholder engagement. Executing process group, you've got manage stakeholder engagement. Monitoring and controlling process group, you've got monitor stakeholder engagement. So these are the four processes of stakeholder management knowledge area. We will take a quick look at all these four processes. It is going to be very brief, and we will definitely have videos that are going to explain these processes in an elaborate manner later on. Okay, before we go there, I'd like to remind you youtube.com/PMC Lounge/playlists. That's where the gold is. All our videos, all the knowledge areas, all important topics are arranged cleanly in playlists here. So do check it out. Okay, so the first process of stakeholder management knowledge area is identify stakeholders. This is the process of identifying the people, groups, and organizations that could impact or be impacted by the project. So remember the definition of stakeholder. We said people, groups, or organization that can impact or can be impacted or even perceived to be impacted by the project. They are all your project's stakeholders. And in this process of identifying stakeholders, that is exactly what you're trying to do. You're trying to come up with a list of all the stakeholders of your project. Now, an important point here is this can include the decision, activity, or outcome of the project. What do we mean here? So when we say someone who could impact or be impacted by the project, when we say project, we mean here any decision that you're going to take as part of the project, any activity that you are going to carry on as part of your project, and the outcome, the very outcome of your project, right? All of this. If someone who is going to be impacted by the decision that you take, any kind of decision that you take as part of your project, right? You could take hundreds of decisions. So if one of those decision is impacting someone, or if someone has the influence to impact that decision, they are the stakeholders of your project, right? You will have hundreds of activities as part of your project. If someone who can impact those activities or be impacted by those activities, they are your stakeholders. And similarly is the outcome of the project, which means the product, the end product that your project generates, the service or any other outcome that your project is going to generate, right? If someone is going to be impacted by it, or if someone who has the influence to impact it, and even someone who perceives to be impacted, all of these are going to be your stakeholders. So that's how you identify stakeholders. It is going to be an exhaustive list for sure. The next process in stakeholder management knowledge area is plan stakeholder engagement. So this is where you're engaging your stakeholders. And this is the process you are going to develop appropriate management strategies. So this is the process where you're developing appropriate management strategies to effectively engage stakeholders throughout the project lifecycle, throughout the entire life cycle of the project. You want to make sure that your stakeholders are engaged with the project. So you are coming up with management strategies on how you can engage those stakeholders. That's all that you're doing in plan stakeholder engagement process. Next is manage stakeholder engagement. This is the process where you are communicating and working with the stakeholders to meet their expectations and ensure that their engagement in the project remains alive, right? So you are basically communicating a lot. You are communicating as per the requirements of the stakeholders. You are working with them to make sure that you are meeting their expectations, your project is meeting their expectations, and that's how you're ensuring that their engagement remains with your project. So managing engagement is all about this process, and hence it is called manage stakeholder engagement. Finally, the last process in stakeholder management knowledge area is monitor stakeholder engagement. This is the process where you're monitoring the overall stakeholder relationships, and you're also adjusting your strategies and plans if required for keeping the stakeholders engaged. So you want to make sure that your stakeholders are engaged throughout the life cycle of your project, throughout the entire project. So this is the process. When you're monitoring the stakeholder engagement, this is where you are going to take a look at the overall relationship that the stakeholders have with you, with your project. And if required, you're going to make changes in your strategies and plans. If something is not working, let's say something is not working towards the end of the project, and that's where a lot of stakeholders seem to be disengaging with the project. So what can you do? What changes can you do to make sure that towards the end of the project as well, your stakeholders remain engaged with the project? So these kind of changes in the strategies and plans, this is what you're doing in the monitor stakeholder engagement process. You are making sure that the stakeholder relationship remains at the highest level during the entire course of your project. So that's all that we had in this video, the basics of stakeholder management. I hope it was clear to you. It was a good primer for you. Smash that like button if you got value out of it. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to stay notified whenever we upload new content. Also, don't forget to check out the website pmclounge.com, your number one free PMP resource.